To understand why Private Moon's actions were so revolutionary, you first have to understand the catastrophic failure of the tool he was given. The problem had actually begun 2 years earlier, during the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942. That was when American forces first realized that the war in the Pacific would bear no resemblance to the war in Europe. European warfare was a conflict of trenches, hedgerows, and open fields, terrain where you could lob an explosive and expect it to do its job. But the Japanese commanders in the Pacific had abandoned open warfare entirely. They exploited the natural geography, digging into hillsides and reinforcing ancient coral caves to create mutually supporting networks that turned every island into a singular, massive fortress. Against these defenses, the American soldier walked into battle with the Mark II fragmentation grenade, a weapon that had been the standard issue since 1918. It was a heavy, cast-iron pineapple designed for the trenches of World War I. Its serrated body was engineered to shatter into deadly shrapnel with a kill radius of 10 meters. In an open field in France, it was devastating, but in the Pacific, the Japanese bunkers presented a geometry problem that the Mark II could not solve. To be effective, the grenade had to pass through a firing slit that was often no wider than 8 inches, usually positioned at an awkward angle. Even worse, it had to detonate inside the bunker. If it exploded outside, the thick coral walls simply absorbed the blast. This is where the design of the Mark II became a liability. It was too round and too elastic against the hard coral. Throwing it at a bunker was, as the physics dictated, like throwing a baseball against a concrete wall. The failure rate was nothing short of catastrophic. Field reports from the bloody sands of Tarawa in November 1943 documented the grim reality. Only 1 in 12 fragmentation grenades successfully entered an enemy bunker. The other 11 would bounce off the wall, roll back down the slope, or detonate harmlessly in the dirt. And every failed throw bought the Japanese defenders time. Time to return fire, time to call for reinforcements, and time to kill the Americans exposed in the open. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department was well aware of the problem, but their solutions were bureaucratic rather than practical. They developed special rifle adapters to launch grenades further. They lengthened fuses to give soldiers more time to aim. They instituted rigorous training courses to teach proper throwing angles. None of it worked. By early 1944, the experts had doubled down on their dogma. Field Manual 23-30 explicitly stated that fragmentation grenades were the only safe option for bunker assaults. Their reasoning was based on safety and predictability, prioritizing the known fuse times and proven lethality of the Mark II over the reality that it simply couldn't get into the target.
There was, of course, an alternative sitting right in the supply crates, but it was strictly forbidden. The M15 White Phosphorus grenade was classified as a chemical weapon, intended solely for creating smokescreens and signaling. The canister carried a stark warning in red letters, not for offensive use. The chemical inside burned at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit and could not be extinguished by water. Army safety regulations prohibited throwing them into confined spaces because the risk of catastrophic burns to friendly forces was considered too high. The doctrine was unambiguous. Using white phosphorus to clear a bunker was a violation of orders. So the slaughter continued. The refusal to adapt tactics to the terrain had a direct cost in human lives. The capture of Kwajalein in February 1944 cost 372 American casualties. Eniwentuk in March added another 339. As the casualty reports stacked up on desks in Washington, General Douglas MacArthur's staff calculated a grim projection. At these rates, the drive toward the Philippines would cost over 50,000 American lives before the end of the year. The Army was preparing to sacrifice thousands of men to a regulation that didn't work, all while the solution sat unused in their packs, banned by a rulebook written in a safety office thousands of miles away. To understand why Private Moon's actions on Biak were so revolutionary, you have to go back to where the problem began, the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942. This was the moment American forces collided with a Japanese defensive strategy that bore no resemblance to the warfare they had trained for. In the European theater, the war was defined by trenches, hedgerows, and open maneuvers, environments where standard infantry tactics worked as intended. But in the Pacific, Japanese commanders had abandoned open warfare entirely. They exploited the volcanic geology of the islands, digging into hillsides and reinforcing natural coral caves to create mutually supporting bunker networks that turned every hill into a fortress. Against these hardened positions, the American soldier was equipped with the Mark II fragmentation grenade, a heavy cast-iron pineapple designed for the trenches of World War I. Its serrated body was engineered to shatter into deadly shrapnel with a kill radius of 10 meters. In an open field in France, it was devastatingly effective. But in the Pacific, the Mark II was a liability. The bunkers presented a geometry problem that fragmentation grenades could not solve. To be effective, the grenade had to pass through a firing slit often no wider than 8 inches, positioned at awkward angles, and it had to detonate inside the bunker.
This is where the physics of the Mark II guaranteed failure. The grenade was too round and too elastic against the hard coral surfaces. Throwing it at a bunker was, as the physics dictated, like throwing a baseball against a concrete wall. The failure rate was catastrophic. Field reports from the bloody sands of Tarawa in November 1943 documented the grim reality. Only 1 in 12 fragmentation grenades successfully entered an enemy bunker. The vast majority would bounce off the coral walls, roll back down the slope, or detonate harmlessly outside, where the thick walls absorbed the blast. Every failed throw gave the Japanese defenders time to return fire, call for reinforcements, and kill the exposed Americans. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department responded to this crisis not by changing the weapon, but by doubling down on the Doctrine. They developed special rifle adapters to launch grenades further and designed longer fuses to give soldiers more aiming time. They created rigorous training courses to teach proper throwing angles. None of it worked. By early 1944, the experts had reached a consensus that was lethal in its rigidity. Fragmentation grenades were the only safe option for bunker assaults. Official Field Manual 2330 explicitly stated this, citing the predictable fuse times and safety features of the Mark II. There was an alternative sitting in the supply crates, but it was strictly forbidden. The M15 White Phosphorus grenade was classified as a chemical weapon, intended solely for smoke screens and signaling. The canister carried a stark warning in red letters, not for offensive use. The chemical inside burned at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit and continued to burn even underwater. Army safety regulations prohibited throwing them into confined spaces because the risk of catastrophic burns to friendly forces from splashback or unpredictable smoke was considered too high. The doctrine was unambiguous. Using white phosphorus against bunkers was a violation of orders. So the slaughter continued, driven by a refusal to adapt. The capture of Kwajalein in February 1944 cost 372 American casualties, and Etowatok in March added another 339. As the casualty reports stacked up in Washington, General Douglas MacArthur's staff calculated a grim projection. At these current rates, the drive toward the Philippines would cost over 50,000 American lives before the end of 1944. The Army was effectively choosing to sacrifice thousands of men to a regulation that didn't work, all while the solution sat and used in their packs, banned by a rulebook written in a safety office thousands of miles away.
Private Harold Moon was nobody's idea of a military innovator. Born in 1922 in Grundy County, Iowa, he had dropped out of high school after the 10th grade to work on his father's dairy farm. His military file was unremarkable, listing him as average in marksmanship and merely satisfactory in grenade throwing. But Moon possessed a specific type of intelligence that didn't show up on aptitude tests, a visceral, intuitive grasp of physics born from years of manual labor. He knew how objects moved through space not because he had studied equations, but because he had spent his youth throwing hay bales into lofts and tossing heavy tools across barnyards. He understood weight, arc, and momentum in his hands rather than his head. On the morning of May 18th, while his platoon was pinned down, Moon's insight was triggered by a simple logistical error. During a pre-dawn equipment check, a supply clerk had made a mistake, mixing 2 M15 White Phosphorus grenades into Moon's standard allotment of explosives.
These canisters were stamped with red warnings, not for offensive use. To a disciplined soldier, these were useless for an assault. They were signaling tools designed to create smoke screens. But as Moon held the M15 in his hand, he didn't see a chemical weapon. He saw a solution to the geometry problem that was killing his friends. The difference was in the density. The standard Mark II fragmentation grenade weighed 21 ounces and was shaped like a lemon, a design that made it aerodynamic but prone to erratic bounces. The M15, however, was a flat-bottomed cylinder weighing nearly 2 pounds. Moon felt the heft of it and immediately understood the physics at play. Throwing the lighter fragmentation grenade at a coral bunker was like skipping a stone. It wanted to deflect. But the M15 was heavy. It was dead weight. Moon realized that if he threw this canister, it wouldn't bounce off the wall. It would carry its momentum through the air and drop like a stone falling into a well. There was another critical variable: time. The Mark II grenade had a 5-second fuse, which gave Japanese defenders inside the bunker enough time to pick it up and throw it back, or simply wait for it to roll away before it detonated. The M15 had a shorter 4-second fuse. This reduced the margin of error significantly. If Moon could get the heavy canister through the slot, it would detonate almost immediately on impact. The combination of the heavier weight, the flat shape, and the shorter fuse created a ballistics profile that was perfectly suited for the specific task of penetrating a narrow, horizontal slit in a rock face. The moment of decision was fraught with tension. As Moon weighed the forbidden grenade in his palm, his platoon sergeant noticed the gray canister. "Moon, what the hell are you doing? Those are smoke grenades. Put it back," the sergeant ordered, adhering strictly to the training that defined the M15 as a non-lethal signaling device. Moon's response was simple and grounded in the physical reality he was observing. "They won't bounce," he said.
He looked at the bunker that had already killed 7 of his squad mates. He looked at the useless fragmentation grenades lying in the dirt. He realized that the regulations were written for a war they weren't fighting. In that moment, Moon decided to violate direct orders and ignore the entire U.S. Army Ordnance Department. He wasn't thinking about the chemical reaction or the heat. He was thinking about the trajectory. He pulled the pin on the M15, stood up, and let the heavy cylinder fly, trusting the intuition of a farm boy over the doctrine of a general. The arc of that first M15 grenade was different from anything the platoon had seen before. Because of its weight, it didn't wobble or drift in the wind like the lighter fragmentation grenades. It cut a clean, stable parabola through the humid air. It hit the coral face of the bunker, but didn't bounce. Instead, it dropped straight through the narrow firing slit, disappearing into the darkness like a stone falling into a well. Moon counted the seconds: 1001, 1002, 1003, knowing the fuse was shorter than the standard issue. Inside the bunker, the detonation was not the sharp, concussive crack of high explosives that soldiers were used to. It was a dull, muffled eruption that immediately gave way to a hissing roar. Thick, opaque white smoke began to billow violently from every opening: the firing slit, the ventilation shafts, the rear entrance. This was not merely smoke. It was an atmospheric weapon. The white phosphorus inside the canister ignited upon contact with the air, spiking the temperature inside that confined concrete box to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit instantly. The physics of the bunker, which had previously protected the Japanese defenders, now turned against them. The thick walls that stopped bullets now trapped the heat in the chemical smoke, creating a convection oven of unimaginable intensity. The phosphorus ignited everything it touched: wooden support beams, ammunition crates, and human flesh. The Japanese Type 92 machine gun, which had pinned the platoon down for 3 hours, fell silent immediately. There was no return fire because there was no oxygen left to breathe, only searing chemical fumes that burned the lungs with every gasp. Moon's platoon sergeant stared at the smoking ruin in disbelief. He had just watched a stubborn fortification, immune to 3 hours of standard assault, neutralized in 4 seconds. Did that just work? He asked, but Moon didn't wait for an answer. 70 yards to the left, a supporting bunker opened fire, attempting to cover the position Moon had just destroyed. Moon grabbed his second M15, calculated the new angle, and threw. Again, the heavy canister flew true. Again, it entered the slit perfectly. Again, the bunker erupted in chemical fire and went silent. This was the turning point. Moon turned to his sergeant and said, "Get me more of those." When the sergeant instinctively protested that they were smoke grenades not meant for killing, Moon cut him off. "Get me more." For the next several hours, Private Moon operated with a terrifying efficiency that bordered on the mechanical. He moved from bunker to bunker, employing the forbidden grenades with what observers called surgical precision. The heavier weight of the M15 made them easier to control than the bouncy Mark IIs, and the shorter fuse gave the defenders inside zero time to react or throw them back. By noon, Moon had single-handedly cleared 8 bunkers, and his company had advanced 400 yards, the fastest progress they had made since landing on the island 3 days earlier. However, this success inevitably attracted the attention of the command structure. Captain James Winters, the company commander, found Moon during a lull in the fighting. Winters was a West Point graduate, a man trained to respect the rule of law and the Geneva Convention. He confronted Moon with the field manual open, pointing to the regulations in black and white. White phosphorus grenades were classified as chemical weapons, authorized only for signaling and screening. Using them offensively was a direct violation of standing orders and potentially a war crime. Moon, covered in coral dust and sweat, didn't back down. He gestured toward the rear, where medics were loading wounded men onto jeeps. "How many of those guys would be walking if I'd kept using the Mark IIs that don't work?" he asked. When Winters insisted that this could be a court-martial offense, Moon delivered the line that should be etched into every book on military leadership. "Then court-martial me after we take this island." Winters looked at the manual, then at the battlefield. He had watched his men die for 3 days trying to follow regulations that were physically impossible to execute. He closed the book. "I didn't see anything," he told Moon, "but if you get yourself killed doing this, I'm not writing a letter to your mother explaining you died violating direct orders." With the tacit approval of his commander, Moon went back to work. By the time the sun set on May 18, 1944, Private Harold Moon had cleared 20 Japanese bunkers single-handedly. The statistics were staggering. In a campaign where the average cost was 3.2 American casualties for every bunker taken, Moon had neutralized 20 strongholds without a single casualty in his squad during the assaults. His unauthorized, reckless technique had saved an estimated 400 American lives in a single afternoon, proving that on the battlefield, the difference between a war crime and a miracle is often just a matter of what works. News of Private Moon's one-man war traveled fast, too fast for the comfort of the chain of command. By May 20th, just 48 hours after Moon began his unauthorized campaign, the after-action reports reached battalion headquarters, located 2 miles inland. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander McNabb, the battalion commander of the 163rd Infantry, sat at his desk reading a document that presented him with a command paradox. The report detailed the single most successful day of bunker clearing in the entire operation, documenting 20 enemy positions neutralized and 400 yards of ground gained in a sector that had been stalled for days. But it also detailed, in careful military language, a systematic and flagrant violation of U.S. Army weapons regulations.
McNabb called a staff meeting immediately. The canvas walls of the command tent were soon crowded with company commanders, the battalion surgeon, and weapons officers, the air thick with humidity and rising tension. On one side of the table stood Captain Winters, Moon's commander, who had seen the results firsthand. On the other stood Major Robert Thornton, the battalion weapons officer. Thornton was not a villain in this story. He was a man of science and order. A career ordnance officer and a graduate of the Aberdeen Proving Ground Weapons School, he had spent 15 years studying the chemistry of military explosives. To him, what Moon was doing wasn't innovation. It was reckless insanity. "This is insanity," Thornton argued, his voice rising over the hum of the camp generators. "White phosphorus grenades are not designed for offensive use. They're chemical weapons with unpredictable effects in confined spaces. We have regulations against this for good reason." Thornton's argument was sound on paper. He listed the dangers with academic precision.
The chemical burns at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, it destroys human tissue instantly, and it cannot be extinguished with water. If a soldier made a mistake and a fragment of phosphorus splashed back onto American troops, the results would be horrific. Our own men are dying because we're using grenades that bounce off walls, Captain Winters countered calmly. The regulations assume our standard grenades work. They don't. Not against these bunkers. When Thornton insisted that they simply needed better throwing techniques, Winters cut him off. We've had better training for 2 years. It hasn't solved the problem. The debate that followed was the friction point of the entire war. Doctrine versus reality. Thornton argued that safety regulations were written in blood and could not be abandoned because of one private's luck. Winters argued that the only safety that mattered was keeping his men alive, and the current doctrine was killing them. The room erupted into shouting, officers taking sides between the rulebook and the results. Lieutenant Colonel McNabb let them argue for 5 minutes before raising his hand for silence. He didn't want to hear more theories. "Bring me Private Moon," he ordered. 20 minutes later, Harold Moon stood in the center of the command tent. He was a jarring sight against the starched uniforms of the staff officers, covered in coral dust, dried mud, and sweat. He had never been in a battalion headquarters, let alone interrogated by a room full of superiors. McNabb didn't mince words. "Private, Major Thornton tells me you're using white phosphorus grenades offensively. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "You know that violates standing orders." "Yes, sir." "Why did you do it?" Moon's answer was stripped of all military jargon. He didn't speak about tactical advantages or suppression fire. He spoke about physics. "Sir, the Mark II grenades don't work against these bunkers. They bounce off," he explained. "I needed something heavier that would go through the firing slits and stay inside." Major Thornton interrupted, unable to contain his frustration. "It's also incredibly dangerous to our own troops. If that phosphorus splashes back—" "I'm careful about angles," Moon cut off the major. "I only throw when I have a clear shot. I've been doing this for 2 days without any friendly casualties." Thornton scoffed. 2 days isn't enough data."
McNabb looked at his weapons expert, then at the farm boy. He asked the only question that mattered. "Major, how many casualties has this battalion suffered clearing bunkers since we landed?" Thornton checked his notes. 47 killed or wounded, sir. "And how many casualties has Private Moon's technique caused?" The room went silent. The answer was 0. McNabb stood up. He wasn't going to decide this based on a manual written in Washington. He was going to decide it based on what he could see. He looked at Moon. "Show me." The demonstration took place at a captured Japanese position half a mile away from the command tent. Under the skeptical gaze of the battalion staff, Private Moon didn't just explain his theory, he proved it. He approached an abandoned bunker and threw 3 M15 grenades in rapid succession. Each heavy canister defied the expectations of the officers used to bouncing fragmentation grenades. They entered the narrow firing slits perfectly, one after another. Lieutenant Colonel McNabb watched in silence, the reality of the physics overriding the text of the field manual. He turned to Major Thornton, the weapons expert who had declared the technique insanity and issued an order that would change the course of the battle. "Major, effective immediately, authorized the use of white phosphorus grenades for bunker assault," McNabb said. When Thornton protested that this violated Ordnance Department regulations, McNabb's response was final. "Then the Ordnance Department can court-martial me. We have an island to take, and I'm not losing more men following regulations that get them killed." The logistical shift was immediate. Within 24 hours, every rifle company in the 163rd Infantry Regiment received supplemental supplies of M15 grenades, munitions previously left gathering dust in rear supply dumps. Moon was pulled from the line and spent May 21st moving between companies, training squad leaders on the new doctrine. The instruction was brutally simple. Identify the bunker opening, calculate the angle for the heavier projectile, throw the M15 instead of the Mark II, and take cover for 4 seconds. The impact on the battlefield was instant and statistical.
The battalion's casualty rate dropped by 73% over the next week. Field reports documented that prior to Moon's technique, the regiment suffered 6.4 casualties for every bunker eliminated. After adopting the forbidden grenades, that number plummeted to 1.7, with most casualties occurring during the approach rather than the assault itself. For the Japanese defenders, the shift in tactics was terrifying. A diary recovered from the body of Lieutenant Teishi Yamamoto described the new American method with palpable alarm. The enemy now uses chemical fire weapons against our cave positions, Yamamoto wrote. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical one. The white smoke didn't just obscure vision, it filled the intricate tunnel systems, making breathing impossible and raising the ambient temperature to unbearable levels. Men cannot stay at their posts, the diary noted. This is a terrible weapon that defeats our strongest defenses. Even the garrison commander, Colonel Cusum, was forced to report to his superiors that American forces had developed effective countermeasures to their fortifications, noting that the burning chemical grenades were penetrating firing slits and forcing his men to evacuate or die. The impregnable coral fortress of Biak had been cracked open by a farm boy who refused to follow the rules. The ultimate validation of Moon's forbidden technique arrived on June 2, 1944, during the decisive assault on Mokmere airfield. This was the strategic prize of the entire campaign, defended by 68 fortified bunkers arranged in overlapping fields of fire, designed to make any infantry approach suicidal. Moon, now promoted to squad leader, found his men pinned down by 3 mutually supporting bunkers, creating a deadly crossfire. In the previous weeks, this scenario would have stalled the advance for hours and cost half the squad their lives.
Instead, Moon signaled his men to follow him. Using the terrain and the dense smoke from his first throw to mask his movement, he maneuvered into position. He used 2 M15 grenades on the primary bunker, one through the main firing slit, another through a ventilation opening. As the white smoke erupted, silencing the gun, he immediately pivoted to the supporting positions. In just 11 minutes, Moon's squad neutralized 3 major fortifications that should have held them for half a day. The cost to his squad was 0 casualties. By 1400 hours, the regiment had cleared the airfield perimeter, a task staff officers estimated would take 3 days, suffering only 19 wounded and 3 killed, while leaving over 400 Japanese defenders dead in their caves. The mathematics of the war had fundamentally changed. The 41st Division's after-action report, compiled in July 1944, provided the undeniable proof. Before Moon's intervention, the division lost 3.2 men for every bunker they eliminated. After adopting the white phosphorus technique, that number plummeted to 0.8. When applied to the 312 bunkers cleared during the campaign, the calculation was stark. Without Moon's innovation, the operation would have cost approximately 998 American casualties. The actual number was 249. One private's refusal to follow orders had saved nearly 750 American lives on a single island. The technique didn't stop there. By August, it had spread to the Marines on Peleliu and would later be standard practice on Okinawa, saving thousands more before the war's end. Despite the overwhelming statistical proof, official recognition came slowly and reluctantly. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department never formally acknowledged that a private's intuition had outperformed their expert engineering. While Field Manual 2330 was revised in late 1944 to include a note about the alternative employment of smoke grenades, the change was buried in an appendix, carefully avoiding any admission that the standard doctrine had been a failure. Harold Moon received the Silver Star for his actions on May 18th, but the citation was a masterpiece of bureaucratic vagueness. It praised his innovative tactical employment of available resources, while deliberately omitting the fact that those resources were chemically banned weapons used in direct violation of orders. Moon accepted the medal, put it in a drawer, and never spoke of it again. However, the industrial machine of the American military quietly admitted what the officers wouldn't. In 1943, the U.S. produced 2.1 million M15 grenades. By 1945, that number had exploded to 11.2 million. The procurement documents still labeled them as smoke devices, but every soldier in the Pacific knew they weren't being shipped by the millions just to send signals. Conservative estimates suggest that Moon's unauthorized innovation saved between 4,000 and 6,000 American lives during the final bloody year of the war. After the surrender, Moon returned to Grundy County, Iowa, to the same dairy farm he had left. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and lived a life of quiet anonymity.
He refused interviews and declined invitations to speak at veterans groups. To his neighbors, he was just a farmer who knew how to plant corn. But in 1982, at a 41st Division reunion in Des Moines, the past finally caught up with him. An elderly man approached Moon with tears in his eyes. It was the son of Captain James Winters, the company commander who had refused to court-martial him. Winters had passed away, but he had left a message for his son to deliver if he ever found the farm boy from Iowa. Winters had kept a list of every man in Easy Company who survived the war. He had calculated that without Moon's intervention on Bayak, at least 47 of those specific men would have died in the bunkers. The message was simple. He said you were the bravest soldier he ever commanded because you had the courage to be right when everyone else was following orders that were wrong. Moon died in 1998 at the age of 76. His local obituary mentioned his military service in a single sentence, oblivious to the fact that he had revolutionized infantry tactics. But his legacy wasn't written in newspapers. It was written in the lineage of the thousands of men who came home to live full lives because one soldier saw a problem and fixed it. Today, modern Army doctrine includes case studies on innovation under fire, teaching officers that regulations exist to serve the mission, not the other way around. It is a permanent lesson that sometimes the most important breakthrough doesn't come from the experts with credentials, but from the person with the courage to disobey them.